You are listening to another episode of the Coaster101 podcast. I'm Andrew Stillwell, joined this week by John Stevenson. John, how's it going?
It's going pretty good. How about you?
I can't complain. Obviously, we're deep in the recesses of the regional theme park off season right now, and I know you and I, being in North Carolina and Tennessee, are not lucky enough to live in Florida right now, where the parks are still open, or up in Williamsburg, where they're open on the weekends. But we're slowly but surely getting through the off season blues here.
We are. I can see it on the horizon. It's not too far away. We just got to make it a couple more months, and
that's right. There. But as it is the off season, we've lined up a bunch of interviews over the next couple of weeks, and it's kind of an interview series with no real connected theme here, other than, it's people in the industry, people who are not in the industry, but for one reason or another, we felt they would be entertaining guests to talk about theme parks and roller coasters. And John actually recorded our first interview earlier this week with Lindsay Graham, who is the host of the Business Movers podcast series on the Wondery Network. And John, what did you and Lindsay talk about?
So we talked about the podcast is set up. This is a new podcast by Wondery, and it is going to be a series of seasons. And the first season is all about Walt Disney. And it is a 4 episodes season. And it really, the title Business Movers is really all about people who in the industry who are not only in the theme park industry, but just in business in general. And so how they kind of get to the point that they're at with their businesses. And so in this case, that's the Disney empire. And it looks at, what they did right, what they did wrong, what their challenges were, how they made their decisions that kind of guided the trajectory of their businesses. And so Walt Disney obviously is a great candidate to kick off this new podcast, because his story is well known, yet is so, and I guess is so entrenched in American culture, and as far as how we know Disney. And so it really was a fascinating listen. And as of this recording, there have been 3 of the 4 episodes released. But it's really a fascinating look at Walt's life from a business perspective. So you kind of get to go inside the boardroom and hear those discussions and those talks and the secrecy. And the World War II spy who was brought in to help keep his Florida plans under wraps. So we just talked about the podcast. We talked about Lindsay's podcast experience, and this is not his first podcast. He's hosted some very well-known podcasts like American History Tellers, American Scandal, American Elections. So very well-versed in the podcasting world. We talked about kind of what he learned from this podcast and kind of his takeaways on Walt. I threw some questions in there to kind of relate it to current day and how Walt might behave in current events like COVID-19. And so it's really interesting to talk to him. And the podcast is a really interesting listen. I tend to listen more towards the front-facing side of theme parks and roller coasters, not so much from a business perspective. And so it's a really, really interesting conversation with him. And I really recommend listening to the podcast, because I walked away knowing so much more about Walt than I thought I knew. I guess I'd kind of created this narrative just from bits and pieces of his life that I've heard in various media. He had a very turbulent life, a lot of challenges that he had to overcome. And I knew he was very detail oriented, but I didn't realize that perfectionism that really drove him to, possibly to his poor health that he had to deal with in his later years, and of course, ultimately his death. And so, really interesting conversation with Lindsay, and really looking forward to the 4th episode.
Absolutely. And with no further ado, here's John's conversation with Lindsay Graham, host of the Business Movers by Wondery podcast, subject Walt Disney.
Behind every successful company is a story.
Your company will never be great until you've had a near-death experience, and you as a leader have learned to lead it through that.
starts with a leap of faith.
Most people never pick up the phone and call. Most people never ask. And that's what separates sometimes the people that do things from the people that just dream about them. You got to act.
But business is not for the faint of heart. When you take that leap, it can also be a long fall to the bottom.
They are losing their jobs, and these firms are going to go out of business, and he's nuts! They're nuts! They know nothing!
From Wondery, I'm Lindsay Graham, the host of American Scandal and American History Tellers. On my new podcast, Business Movers, we'll bring you the true stories of the brilliant but all too human leaders who risked it all and the game-changing moments that transformed all our lives. There are the booms and the busts.
More bad news for the airline industry. Virgin Atlantic says it is filing for bankruptcy.
The investigations.
At best, you are incompetent. At worst, you were complicit. And either way, you should be fired.
The scandals.
Fixture on Wall Street, Bernie Madoff, 70 years old, arrested by the FBI.
And the men and women who refuse to give up until the job is done.
I want to be at that table, proving that I can do what they do as well as they do it, and then do it better.
Don't miss the 2-episode debut of Business Movers, January 14th on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. Or get early, ad-free access January 7th by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app.
If you're offered a seat on a rocket ship, don't ask what seat. Just get on.
All right, today we are joined by Lindsay Graham, who is the host of the new Business Movers podcast. And Lindsay, thank you so much for being here today. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Great. Well, we're excited to have you here. I know the podcast is a 4-episode podcast, correct?
Yes, with an at the end. Yes, a 5-episode total.
Yes, so we are the first subject of this podcast is Walt Disney. So all very familiar with that name. But first, before we get into the topic, just want to learn a little bit more about you. So I know this is not your first podcast, one of many that you've done. So can you tell us a little about yourself and how you got into the podcasting business?
Sure. I don't know exactly what number podcast this is. It might be my 5th or something. But I started podcasting for real, I guess, in 2017 with Wondery, a podcast called American History Tellers. They invited me to host and sound design that podcast for them back when Wondery was just a nascent force in the industry. They've grown quite a bit and recently sold to Amazon, so they've been doing well. But from the beginning, we had this idea of these podcasts that investigated certain topics of American history, and then we expanded into popular culture with American Scandal, and now business history with Business Movers. And each one is a multi-episode investigation of a single topic that tries to teach something and give listeners more insight into something that they thought they knew, but didn't quite.
Interesting. And so I also know you have a little bit of background in recording music for radio and film. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's how the whole podcast thing started, really. I never expected to be on this side of the microphone. I was very accustomed to being behind the glass, as they say. So I have this little recording studio that I'm talking to you from in Dallas. And I use it to record local bands and produce their albums, and then record my own music for TV and film. That was always really just a hobby that almost paid for itself. But it was nice to have the facilities, and that led me to be able to create a audio drama podcast called Terms, which was really my introduction to Wondery and podcasting on a greater scale. All the music in my podcasts are composed by me, played by me, and that's one of the best parts of the job, really, the fun throwback to my roots there.
Yeah, I will say I did not know that. And I was just thinking, I've been listening to the podcast, of course, over the past week, and I made a mental note that I really liked the music that was in the background that was being woven into the narrative. So that checks out. So
well, thank you.
Really nice music. Yeah. Well, cool. That's really interesting to know how that. It's always interesting to know how that background and the podcast networks are so interwoven like that. So we'll get back to Business Movers and Disney. So when exactly did you become involved with this specific project? How long has it been in the works?
Well, so Business Movers was something that I came to Wondery to develop because I had a podcast called American Elections Wicked Game that followed every American presidential election, all 58 of them, 59 now. But of course, that project had a baked-in end date. It's not really viable for me to sit around on my hands waiting for 4 years for the next election to come around. So I wanted something to replace that time and energy. So I returned to Wondery, a great partner, and asked what they thought we could do together. It was my initial thought that another history-centered project would probably be the one, but they said, you know what, we can't get enough of is business programming. And so we said, well, what about a history of business? And even though I am a host of many American history-centered podcasts, I have no education in history. My actual education is in business. I have an MBA in marketing. So it appealed to me that this seemed that a project I might actually know something about from the beginning and not just learn along with my listeners. So I was excited to be in a topic that I had footing in and also continue my podcasting career.
So with the premise of this podcast being these kind of all these brilliant businessmen and women, but as successful as they are, the path to that success is can sometimes be quite a bit of a ride. No pun intended for Walt. But why was he? When there's so many stories to pull from, what led to Walt Disney being the first to be featured?
Well, I think it's appropriate to talk about a business podcast in business terms. This is our first series of a new podcast, and we wanted to come out with a name and a story that people would recognize and was marketable. I mean, those are the business reasons behind the decision. Now, there were a lot of creative reasons behind the decision that are kind of hand in hand there. Walt is a visionary, was a fantastic entrepreneur, and exhibited a lot of traits that people admire and admonish in leaders. So this story, while it wasn't, and I guess the angle we took on it is indicative of what we want to do on Business Movers. Even though you've probably heard the Walt Disney story, you certainly know of him and his company. You don't know all the backroom deals of this particular aspect, this chapter of opening Disney World. We all know what Disney World is, but there were so many steps and so many interesting bits of intrigue along the way. And that's what we hope to tell, the behind closed doors story of these business accomplishments.
Interesting. So were you a fan of Disney? Like, were you a fan of his, I guess, creations, the parks, the movies? How familiar were you with his story prior to this podcast?
Yeah, well, I did not know all the details for sure. Certainly not the involvement of former World War II spies in the acquisition of land in Florida. That sort of cloak and dagger stuff I didn't know. But everyone knows Walt Disney. Everyone appreciates what he's built. I think you cannot grow up in America without having Disney, firmly imprinted on you. And I went to Disneyland and I went to Disney World, and I really enjoyed Epcot when I was young. So it was nice to go back and revisit some of that magic of my youth, but with a more critical adult eye.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to that, and I think that's what I enjoy and I'm enjoying so much about this podcast is we are, especially coaster enthusiasts, theme park enthusiasts, even Disney enthusiasts, are so familiar and know the story from the park. I think from the public facing side. But what really interests me about this show is how it just completely flips, and you're taken backstage to the not to the backstage of the rides, but to the boardrooms and to those meetings and discussions that you just don't really see when you're focused so much on kind of the end result. And so with that in mind, you uncovered so many details in this podcast. So what was one of the most surprising things that you learned about Walt specifically from the show?
Well, I think we learned a little bit of his character, that much more so than you might appreciate from his TV specials. And we delved into his childhood life, his relationship with his brother Roy, his fanatic devotion to detail. But also, I was touched by how he approached his work in the dwindling of his lifetime. I mean, he knew he was on his way out, and probably would not be able to see the opening of Disney World. I thought, and even to the end, he kept working and pushing, probably to his detriment. It was inspiring, and perhaps even a bit, I don't know, melancholy to witness a man of that much vision keep at it until the very end.
Yeah, yesterday I was thinking, at the end of the workday, and I'm like, oh, I'm tired. And then I, think about Walt, and that was one of the things that really resonated with me, that work ethic, and knowing his childhood. That was another thing that surprised me. His childhood was not as rosy as I envisioned it being. That he really had a relatively rough childhood, and how much of a good relationship he had with Roy. So it was really just listening to this, I was just like one thing after the other, just completely kind of redefining my idea of Walt's background. So moving on to his creations, what was coming from this show, what were some of the things about the park specifically, or the attractions that you found surprising, or something that listeners might not expect?
I think Walt's determination that Epcot be a real experimental prototype community of tomorrow. Like I said, I visited Epcot when I was a child, and it is a fantastic place, but it is part of an amusement park. It is not a real functioning community, and yet, there's a lot of aspects of advanced urban planning built into it. But Walt's desire to make it to make the Florida Project Future, much bigger than just an amusement park, that the park would in a sense subsidize this grander experiment in American life. I found fascinating that it was just an enormously ambitious goal to reinvent the way Americans lived. Yeah, I don't think he achieved that scale, especially with his passing. But it was really interesting to me to see how a visionary in entertainment can take that same drive and apply it to something that may not seem related at all, civics and urban planning.
And so, with this story, his life is so, in his relatively short life, he accomplished so much, and was able to, even though, he didn't live to see Disney World open, it still has obviously had such an immense impact on the globe, really. Were there any parts that you thought, with a four part, with only so much airtime, so to speak, were there any areas of his life, or what he did, that you think were especially, I was like, oh, I wish I could have had another 2 hours to discuss that? What areas do you think are possibly open for another podcast, or further exploration?
No, there's so much on the cutting room floor. I'm positive, but one thing that interested me, actually, that we didn't get to touch on, it just didn't fit in the story, but was Walt's keen eye, and really how inventive he was as an animator, and in the early film, his early films. He studied quite a bit of the art form, Buster Keaton and other films, comedic films, and took their camera moves and their physical comedy and applied it to this animated mouse. It was really changing the game, and he took this tinkering, this iterative improvement, this stealing of best practices and turning it into something new, and did it over and over and over again. And I think actually probably writ large did this in the difference between Disneyland and Disney World. So yeah, there was a lot of his early career and why Walt was good at what he did that we didn't get to explore.
Interesting. And going back to kind of backtracking a little bit to Epcot, and that was one of the things that I really was fascinated by, with just how lofty his vision for Epcot and what he was planning to do with it. And one of the things that stuck out to me was he was being interviewed by a reporter, and the reporter made kind of a comment, "Isn't that a little socialist?" And he did that right eyebrow raise. And so what do you think, looking at what his plans for that were, and do you agree with that question? What are your thoughts on how the feasibility of Epcot and his original view of it, where it really was kind of a self-contained community? Do you think that was at all viable, or was it just too ambitious?
Well, I think history has borne out that most people thought it was too ambitious because it didn't happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, there were more recent attempts in Celebration, for instance, in which the Disney Corporation tries to put together a more idealized community. But it was an ambitious plan to reinvent American urban living. And, you have to imagine, too, it was in a period of time where he was thinking about this in the late 50s and early 60s, in which America itself was reinventing itself. There was a lot of hope and a lot of strife. And I think Walt probably picked up on that zeitgeist and wanted to solve some problems that were facing America. He thought urban development might be the way. As for the socialism charge, that word has so much baggage. We could probably do a whole podcast series on just what is socialism, but I don't think there's a socialist bone in Walt's body. What there is, though, is an understanding of community and just that private enterprise. The idea of innovation and entrepreneurship could be wrapped into government in a way that produces better results for citizens.
Yeah, I agree. I think he definitely had the best of intentions, and it seemed like, well, first and foremost, he was a businessman. I think and it was, at the end of the day, about the bottom line, he really did want his guests to have that memorable, positive experience. And I think the first episode talking about the woes of Disneyland's grand opening, which I had heard some of those before, but it was still, just the attention to detail that he had. And, I can only imagine if Epcot had, been realized like he originally was envisioning it, I'm sure it would have been a wonderful place to live if it had that Disney experience. So, but one of the things that I think that I really enjoyed this show is that it doesn't shy away from the challenges and the struggles that he had. It's not, it's not all as rosy even at Disney World. And so it got me thinking, if we were to go to today's climate with COVID-19 specifically regarding the theme parks, it has completely wreaked havoc on theme parks across the globe. And so, of course, California parks are still closed, have not reopened. The Florida parks reopened over the summer. How do you think that Walt, knowing how he handled the opening of Disneyland and the design of Walt Disney World and that perfectionism, that attention to detail, how do you think he would have reacted to COVID-19 when the restrictions and everything that comes with that, with the park reopening? What do you think his opinion of it would have been?
Well, it's hard to know. I'm sure persons who have studied Walt much more deeply than I might come up with a different opinion. But I do know that what Walt was most interested in was happiness. It is the driving force behind his desire for Epcot and a bigger, better experience in Florida. He looked at what was happening in Disneyland and saw that people were happy, were influenced by by this environment that he created, and he was thereby making them happier, and he just wanted more of that. It's a very simple impulse, but I think it was an overriding one. So I would have to imagine that Walt would look at his business and realize, be heartbroken that theaters are closing and parks are closing, but also realize that no one who is ill or dying is happy. I would think that he would probably try to thread the needle as best he can to figure out ways to keep things open, or to shift and pivot so that he can maintain his, the largest happiness ratio he could. I would think, for instance, that he probably would hate the idea that Disney films skip the theaters and go to streaming, but I would imagine that he would make that choice. Because while happiness might be his overriding concern, he is also a business person who understands that there are trade-offs. And I just can't imagine a person of Walt Disney's concern for the world would let dollars override a public health concern.
I agree. I think that's a good take. And obviously you can only know so much from hearing interviews and other people. But was there anything after finishing this podcast or finishing this piece on Walt, if you were able to sit down with him and ask him one question, do you have one that's just that kind of that burning desire to know one thing? Do you know what you would ask him?
Oh goodness. I haven't even contemplated this. I bet with a mind as prolific as his, that he had notebook after notebook of ideas, like the unreleased songs in Prince's vault, that of sketches and ideas and thoughts and scraps of paper stuffed into pockets and drawers. I would love him to show me his vault. I would love to just discuss with him what he wanted to do after Epcot. How big was his ambition? I think it would be fun to dream with him.
It's a great idea. Yes, I would like to go in that vault as well. So one last Disney question. You said you've been to some of the parks. Do you have a favorite Disney ride?
Oh, well, I'm sure many of them have changed in the 25 years that it's been, since I've last gone. No, it's gotten that 35 years. Who knows? So no, I could not name them. I remember, let's see. Okay, I do have one story. But no, I don't, because that was a different theme park.
Any theme park. We're a roller coaster and theme park podcast. So
right, okay.
Any stories.
So on one of these trips, and I really was probably 9 or 10. There was a live show featuring Benji, the dog, and so there's lots of kids in the audience with their families, and at one point, volunteers are asked for, and I got picked. So I got to go up on stage and sit in the middle of the stage in a little director's folding chair, and they said, "Well, what we're going to do is show you how smart Benji really is." And so they gave me a blindfold and blindfolded me, and then I was supposed to whisper a article of clothing into Benji's ear, and he would go backstage and get it. And so I did. I said, "Sock." And he went back, and he came back, and the audience clapped, and he brought a sock, and this happened twice. And then, of course, they turned the tables on me. He came back the third time with a brassiere, and everyone roared in laughter, and I was mortified. I will never forgive them, because
that
that ruined my day. I didn't, I was protesting. I didn't say that. Poor little 10-year-old Lindsay was made a fool of by a dog.
Oh, that's funny. That would be a little traumatizing for sure. Just being, that's funny. Okay. Well, so what can we look forward to? Obviously this is not the end of once we conclude Walt's story, that's not going to be the end of Business Movers. So what can we look forward to in the next installments?
Sure. We are still plotting out quite the course of the podcast, but we do know what's coming next. We're going to do a series on Coca-Cola's greatest mistake, the debut of New Coke in the 80s. And so we think it's widely known or thought to be just a marketing and PR blunder, and it was. But if you look back at the history and the decisions that they made, many of them were made for the right reasons. So we're going to investigate that.
Awesome. And do you have any other podcast or projects you'd like to share with us that we can check out?
Always. So go back to the original. American History Tellers is available and still going weekly, and its sister show, American Scandal. If you have any interest in American presidential history, there's American Elections Wicked Game. And then I have 2 audio dramas, 1865 and Terms, which are both historical political dramas.
Awesome. We will put those in the show notes. Well, Lindsay, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. Really, really enjoyed the podcast. I'm looking forward to the next episode. It's a really, really insightful, fascinating look into this man's life and really the foundation for these theme parks that obviously today we know and love so well. So well, thank you again, and feel free come back anytime.
Well, thank you so much. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks, John, for that fascinating interview. That'll do it for this week's episode of the Coaster101 podcast. Thanks again to Lindsay Graham, host of Business Movers podcast, which is part of the Wondery Podcast Network. As of this recording, you can find the first 3 episodes of Business Movers on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or pretty much anywhere you can find the Coaster101 podcast. That reminds me, make sure you're subscribed, following, rating, reviewing, and any of the rest of the podcast buzzwords wherever you happen to listen to podcasts. It really helps people find our show and learn more about us. We're also on social media, pretty much anywhere you can consume the platform, at Coaster101. Feel free to drop us an email about the show, email address as podcast@coaster101.com, and we definitely love hearing from listeners. Thanks, as always, to JM Music Design for our theme music, and be sure to come back next week as we have another great interview guest lined up. We'll talk to y'all then. See you later.